In my previous video, I showed you a 50% semolina sourdough bread recipe and explained the particularities of semolina flour in the bread baking process. Today, I push the limits and use only semolina flour for this recipe. Would it work? Is there something you need to know before launching yourself in a full semolina bread? Let's see! You need only 4 ingredients for this bread: semolina flour, water, semolina sourdough starter and salt. The steps to prepare the dough spread over one day, and the bake is happening the day after. It might look long, but there are no more than 30 to 45 minutes of your time involved in the entire process. I prefer to do the first step by hand, but you may easily use a mixer. Give a drink to the flour and mix just until there is no more dry flour. Semolina flour has a yellowish color and a grainy texture, and when mixed with water looks sandy and feels like preparing polenta. The dough does not come together like wheat dough would. Be patient, things will change. The flour needs time to absorb the water and the consistency will change miraculously. Allow it 2 hours to properly absorb the water and for the autolysis to happen. I made a video about the autolysis process, check the link above to understand more. Check this out. This doesn't look anymore like the grainy texture we've seen 2 hours ago, and I've done nothing more than wait for Mother Nature to do its job. Just for this bread, I fed the starter only with semolina the evening before, and by now it doubled its volume and is ready to join the main dough. I use a mixer to combine the starter in, because it requires less effort, and in the meantime I can take care of other things from my kitchen. If you do not have a mixer, do it by hand, as the result will be very similar. This is amazing! Notice how smooth the dough is. Do you recall how grainy it was in the beginning? But for now, let it rest again for 1 hour. Enough resting. Let's check again the gluten network. The dough looks very elastic and breaks only when it's stretched too far in a very thin layer. All those relaxation steps had a purpose: to develop the gluten properly. There is a reason why salt is the last ingredient to add to the dough, and this is because it strengthens the already formed gluten network. I mix for 5 minutes on the slowest speed to integrate the salt and reorganize the gluten network. Then it will rest again. The gluten network evolved visibly so far. Look how thin I can stretch it now without breaking it. The next step is to take the dough out of the bowl, stretch it a bit and divide it into 2. Because semolina has low quality gluten compared to wheat, I had to extend the autolysis to 2 hours. This helped the gluten to develop to its maximum potential. Please note that I only use gentle movement to manipulate the dough to preserve this gluten network. No slap and fold technique, no dough pressing techniques that would damage its sensible structure. A good dough structure is essential to trap the CO2 produced by the sourdough bacteria and the wild yeasts. Those bubbles are very small at this stage, but they grow bigger and bigger through the entire fermentation and baking process. You may consider this lamination step optional. It is not an essential step, but I do it almost every time for a few reasons. First, it gives me a good indication of the dough state. Does it stretch easily? Does it break easily? Second, it does help in reorganizing the dough structure as it creates layers over layers. This means that the weak connections in the gluten network will break, but they will allow new stronger connections to form. Third, if I want to enrich the dough with seeds, lamination is the perfect moment to add them. You can do this lamination only with your wet hands on a slightly wet board. Do not try this with flour, it won't work. This is just a technique to stretch and fold, but performed in an extreme way. The dough is stretched as far as possible without breaking or until you reach the limits of your table. But if you do not have enough space, even a 40 by 40 cm square will help. Then, it is folded in three and folded again or rolled to create multiple layers of dough. For the second piece of dough, I do exactly the same. This dough behaved very well this time, but it is not always the case. Because the dough is in such good shape, I choose to do only 2 partial coil folds. You might need to adapt and add more coil folds if your dough doesn't look the same. Even if you follow a recipe by the letter, you do not have the same exact flour or the same environment as the recipe author, and the results can be different. To address this, there is only one solution. Train your eye and hand to adapt when things are not going as expected. One of the trickiest questions is when to stop the first fermentation and shape the dough. The eye and the experience can give a clue, but a pH meter will give a scientific measure of the acidity of the dough. I am ready to shape the dough when the pH meter indicates a value between 4.2 to 4. The exact value in this range varies depending on the type of dough. Oh, but please do not run now to buy a pH meter. I'm pretty sure your grandmother baked fantastic bread even without knowing what the pH was. I use this device because I love the science behind baking, but the eye, skills, and repetition are all well-tested tools. For example, check the size of the bubbles on the bottom of the bowl before shaping. If you want a denser crumb, shape when the bubbles are small. But if you target an open crumb, you might want to ferment the dough more. For this semolina dough, I shaped it early, when the bubbles were small, pH 4.2, to avoid damaging the delicate structure. Semolina dough feels stronger and puffier in my hands than classic wheat dough. The semolina flour is very absorbent, but its weak gluten does not behave well when the dough is overhydrated. That's why I kept the hydration of this dough at 70%. For the second piece of dough, I do the same. To recap, do you see the small bubbles? If an artist is hiding in you, the decoration of the dough might be your favorite part. If not, a simple dust of flour on top of the dough will also do the trick, and you can pass to the scoring part. The scoring can also be artistic and/or functional. How you score the loaf is not just a matter of design. The scoring will influence the shape of the final loaf and will guide the gases to escape the dough during the baking process. We've done our part so far. Now, let's see the result. Bake semolina dough at a lower temperature than classic wheat dough. Would you dare to cut such loaves? Not until they've cooled down. Semolina bread has a pale yellow color and a slightly sweeter taste. Expect a denser crumb. I don't know about you, but I go for the butter now.